Hi, it's Mike with AskTractorMike.com. Got a viewer question today, and I have an expert on grease who is going to answer the question about grease zerks. And I have with me today Wes, who's the guy that brought Lube Shuttle, which is a cool grease gun with a screw-in canister. He brought that product to North America. It's absolutely one of my favorite products. And Wes is going to talk today about grease zerks, something he's had a lot of experience with, and most of us around farm equipment have had some experience with. Here's our question. I don't know if you have done a video on this, grease fitting threads. A lot of people, especially newbies to tractors, don't know about the different thread sizes. I know there are 1/4, 28 threads, drive-in fittings, metric fittings, 1/8 pipe, and maybe others. The drive-ins seem to be the ones that give more trouble. I'm in north central Kentucky, have been a farmer mechanic most of my life, and also worked for a Massey dealer. All right, Wes, let's talk about grease zerks. And first off, it's my opinion that grease zerks are not made as well as they used to be. I was working around a piece of equipment I own that's not that old the other day, and I was greasing it, and the zerk just, as I pulled the grease gun out, the zerk just came out, and I've got to replace it, and I haven't done that yet. So, are grease zerks not as good as they used to be? Are we seeing more failures than before?
Yeah. First, Mike, thanks for having me on. It's always fun to address these questions that people are seeing in real time. And yeah, I mean, the truth is, grease zerks, like everything, have become kind of a price point product. There's a lot of them on any piece of equipment. So if you can save a couple of pennies on them, that's a lot of, the case with OEMs right now. One, they were hard to get during COVID, and some new suppliers came to the market, and they didn't really adhere to some of the standards, and it caused a lot of issues downstream. So when we look at zerk fittings, one of the most common misconceptions is that people think the head of the zerk changes. So they'll call and say, well, we have metric fittings. Is your coupler going to fit on a metric fitting? So the head, the bulb of a zerk fitting, is always going to be what they call like a DIN. It's an industrial norm. They're all supposed to be the same size so that any coupler is going to fit on there. And unfortunately, a lot of places nowadays don't adhere to those norms, or their quality control just isn't tight enough to make sure that all those zerk fittings are meeting those requirements. So what you end up with is zerk fittings that leak. When you put your coupler on, it might be loose. The coupler might get stuck on there. There's just a lot of problems that have kind of popped up within the last, especially the last 5 years, but it really started probably 10 years ago, where we start to see the quality of zerk fittings, go down. So yeah, I mean, like in regard to your follower or viewer, I have a book, and I mean, lubrication is what AET does, but I have a book that's 1,800 pages long, and all it has in it is zerk fittings. So there are a lot of zerk fittings out there in a lot of different threads and a lot of different angles and different things.
What do I need to do? I've got a grease zerk that came out. I don't know if it broke off, if there's a part of it still in there, if it's a press in and it just came out. This just happened, by the way, so I've got to do some research. But what do you need to do when you've got either a broken grease zerk or one that's come out?
Yeah, so I mean, what I always do, if you have an owner's manual, try to refer to it. They don't always tell you what size zerk fittings are being used, right? And the problem is, it's very, very difficult to tell what the thread size is on a zerk fitting because they're so small. So unless you have a thread gauge and then almost a magnifying glass, like, it's very difficult to find out what threads you have. And then the other thing that complicates that is drive-in fittings are very common nowadays. And, they honestly don't work that great. You drive them in, well, a grease gun generates 15,000 PSI. So how long is that drive-in fitting really going to adhere and hold into place? Most likely, if your fitting pulled out, I'm guessing you have a drive-in fitting. And when you look at that fitting, it's going to look like it has threads on it, but they're just straight. They don't have a pitch to them. And when you drive that in, it's supposed to hold. And, sometimes they do. A lot of times they don't. They're by far the quickest to install. So OEMs like putting them on things because they just get, driven in, and the machine goes down. You don't have to spit them, don't have to turn them, don't have to torque them, nothing. But it makes it harder for the end user. Once a drive-in fitting fails, the second drive-in fitting you put in there is probably also going to fail, right? Because you already ripped part of the interior out of there. So the first thing is you have to really make sure that there's not part of that fitting left inside of that bearing or bushing housing. And that can be a little bit difficult. But a nice way to do it is on tractors, we a lot of the time have another fitting, right? So a tractor symmetrical, like right to left, typically with grease fittings. So if you can take one out on the other side, you're either going to double your problem and have two broken fittings, or you're going to have an idea of what's in there and what that fitting should look like. So that's a simple way to do it. They're almost always never going to be smaller than like an 1/8 inch thread. So if the hole where the zerk fitting came out of is smaller than that, then you probably have a broke off fitting and you're going to need some type of removal tool to pull that out. And you can buy, they're called like easy outs. You can get them at like a Napa or a hardware store to remove that fitting.
So where do I get good quality grease zerks if I'm replacing one? I've been online just a little bit and I've seen that people sell, and a lot of times you'll see them sold in assortments, but how do I know I'm getting good ones?
You really don't. So that's not a comforting thought. Zerk fittings, for the most part, they're all going to be made in the Far East, so Asia and India. And quality control there is a little bit lapse, to be honest. So even in a bag of Zerk fittings, you're going to have a lot of ones that don't actually meet specification with the heads. We're a German-based supply company, so all of our stuff comes out of Germany. We do have Zerk fittings that we sell, but we mainly sell to industrial companies. And my recommendation, if you can go to, like an automotive store, will typically have better Zerk fittings than you can get at like a hardware store or like a box chain store or something like that. So I would try there. You can always try your dealership. It's going to be hit or miss with dealerships. Businesses are business. A lot of times they're looking to make the most margin on a product, so they get the cheapest Zerk fitting and mark it up to where the industry kind of allows it, and you might not have that great of a fitting. But once you do find a fitting that works well, I would recommend sticking with it. And one of the complications with tractors nowadays is, even though it's front to back, it's a John Deere tractor like the ones in your background there. Well, the Zerk fittings on the loader and the bucket and all that are probably different than the ones on the tractor. And then there's even going to be components on the tractor that are assembled in a different factory that are going to have different style fittings. So if you look really closely at Zerk fittings on one tractor, you might have 10 or 12 different types coming out of 2 or 3 different factories. So that really makes it hard. But I would look towards, go to a little bit more expensive store, and we're talking Zerk fittings, so they're not expensive to begin with, but there's probably a big difference between a bag of 100 for $20 and a bag of 100 for $80 or $90.
When we first started getting to know one another, we talked a lot about grease fittings because I knew you were an expert on the subject, and I get viewer correspondence all the time, people that watch my YouTube channel that have had either they're having trouble getting a grease zerk to take grease, or they've broken one off like I have. And it just boggles my mind that manufacturers, on probably the cheapest component of the entire tractor or attachment, are cutting costs by putting a cheaper grease zerk on. But that's happening. It's happening in new tractors. It's happening in new attachments. What in the world? Why would they do that, Wes?
It's a numbers game, right? So if you have 10 or 15 on a tractor and you're making hundreds of thousands of tractors a year, if you can save a penny or two on Zerk fittings, it really adds up over time. And that's the environment that we live in. There's a price point for an end commodity for a tractor. And if you can save a little bit up front, increase your margin, businesses are going to do that. So that's kind of the sad reality there. But you opened up another good point there. So what do you do when a Zerk fitting doesn't take grease? And, my background is I grew up on a farm. We still farm 700-800 acres. And I've my main job now is in the lubricant industry, but my passion probably still is farming. There's nothing more frustrating than when you go to grease something. You don't want to grease anyway, but you're going to grease and now you got a fitting that doesn't take grease. Well, I'll get it next time is a pretty common thought. The problem is you did that 5 times before and now there hasn't been grease in there for a couple of months or a year. And that bearing or bushing is just going to fail now. And there's products out there that inject oil or penetrating oil into a fitting under high pressure, right? So you put oil in this kind of sleeve, you put it on the Zerk fitting, and then you hit the top of it with a hammer and it just shoots penetrating oil into the fitting. That's about the worst thing you can do. And I'll tell you why. Yeah, maybe you get the grease fitting cleared out, right? But now you have penetrating oil in your bearing. And what penetrating oil is known for is having a lot of detergents. And detergents will break a lubrication film. So now you have something that's inhibiting lubrication inside your bearing and it's not going to get out. And a very small amount of penetrating oil is going to degrade grease for a long period of time. So you don't want to be injecting penetrating oil or brake clean or whatever into that closed environment, right? You don't want to put another thing in there, especially something that's going to prevent a grease from working properly. So we'll actually see, and we see this with industrial customers or large construction companies. They've been using, some of these Zerk cleaning devices for years, and well, we still have bearing failures, and this is going on. So we did a test. What happens inside of a bearing when you put even a small amount of penetrating oil, and it actually affects that bearing for like 200 plus hours of runtime. And, the biggest problem is if that bearing gets penetrating oil and then the penetrating oil sits in the bottom of the bearing, it prevents grease from protecting that area. But during non-use, you actually get pitting and then rusting because most penetrating oils are made to evaporate over time. So then you get pitting and rusting where that penetrating oil was sitting. And now you're basically got a ticking time bomb for when that bearing is going to fail. So the only easy way or the only correct way to fix that situation is to remove the Zerk fitting and replace it. And then you might have to use like a small pick or something to clean out that vein where the grease goes in. And if that doesn't work, you got to pull that bearing, clean out that grease vein, and then replace the bearing or put the old bearing back in if it's good.
Sounds to me like any of us that own equipment are going to get really good at replacing grease zerks over time.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's one of those things. It's considered a wear part, even though it shouldn't be. And they're going to wear out, they're going to break, and so you're going to have to replace them from time to time. And one thing you can do, if you get a Zerk fitting out that's broke, try and thread it into something that is 1/8 NPT. So in the grease world or the Zerk fitting world, you're going to have a couple of main thread sizes. There's going to be 1/8 NPT, there's going to be 1/4 NPT, and that's national pipe thread. And now they started labeling them MNPT, which is the same. It just stands for male national pipe thread. I don't know why the change, it just made things more confusing. But then if you have tractors, I don't know if you remember like David Brown tractors, or tractors out of the UK or even out of Europe, you're going to have BSP fittings, which are British standard pipe, and then you're going to have metric. So M10s are very common, M12 threads are very common. But if you can take it and you can buy a nut, right, that's threaded for 1/8 NPT. And you can see if that Zerk fitting threads in and out of there, then you know what thread you have. So it doesn't hurt maybe just to go to your hardware store, pick up a nut that's an M10 metric, that's very common, and maybe a 1/8 NPT nut, and then you can make sure that you know what size your Zerk fittings are. And like I said, if you can look at those threads and they're straight, they don't taper one way or another, then it's going to be a drive-in fitting, and then you're going to be limited typically to replacing that with a drive-in fitting. And people from time to time, because drive-in fittings keep coming out, they'll try and cement them in place with some type of adhesive. If you get that in the wrong place, that's never going to take grease. So that's something you really have to watch out for. in some rare cases, you might be better off to, if you're mechanically inclined enough, to tap that non-threaded hole and then put a threaded fitting in there.
Gotcha. Not the news we want, but that's the reality of where we're at. Well, Wes, I appreciate you joining us today. I'm going to put a link up here to Lube Shuttle. If you've not checked this product out, you need to. It's a German-built grease gun with a thread-in canister, and it'll change your life. Doesn't make the grease zerk any better, but it sure makes greasing the grease zerk a whole lot easier and a whole lot cleaner. So, Wes, thanks for joining us today and clearing all that up.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Mike.